All right, thank you all for sticking around after lunch. I think we got some people back, and that 40% number I think was off. So we're all in here, and we've got an awesome panel for you this afternoon. The knowledge base that you have here, you're going to go away with some really invaluable takeaways, and so I'm excited to get started and introduce my panel. I'm JoyAnn Kenny. I'll be the moderator for this session, and I'm a franchise attorney with Fisher Zucker. I've been practicing in the franchise space for 20 years now. Lane was my intro into franchising, so I owe all of my happiness and success to him. And I started back in law school, and then I moved to San Diego, worked in-house as general counsel to 2 affiliated franchise brands before I moved to Florida, started my own practice. I worked with a couple of franchise firms working on litigation and transactional matters, moved back to New Jersey, worked with a franchise firm based out of North Jersey, and I worked with multi-unit Planet Fitness franchise operators. So I've had experience on the buy side, sell side, and franchise businesses, and also in connection with franchisors and the offer and sale of franchise systems in that setting. I've got an awesome panel here for you this afternoon. Josh Cohen, he's the founder and CEO of the Junkluggers franchise system. And Junkluggers started franchising back in 2012. Josh grew the system to just shy of 100 units by the end of 2021, and then sold to Authority Brands in 2022. So really fast trajectory for the brand. I've got Heather McLeod, CGO for Authority Brands. And Heather's Authority Brands companies include 15 leading home service brands with more than 2,000 territories operated by over 1,000 owners in the US, Canada, and in Latin America. We have Irene Liu, Vice President for Apax Partners. Apax Partners is a leading global private equity advisory firm, and the firm's raised and advised funds with aggregate commitments of over $60 billion. The funds provide long-term equity financing to build and strengthen world-class companies. And last but not least, we have Brian Alice. He's a managing director for Boxwood Partners. Boxwood Partners is a mid-market investment banking firm based in Jupiter, Florida. Boxwood focuses on sell-side advisory for founder and private equity companies across the middle market. All right, so with that, we've got Josh and Junkluggers. They've just gone through a transaction in December of 2022, so nice and fresh. And he started growing the brand in 2012 and had the sale transaction in 2022. That's pretty fast growth. And Josh, when you're growing a system, at some point you get to the point where you feel ready for a sale transaction. When did that happen for you, and where were you in that process when you realized that that was the next step for you or something you were considering? Yeah.
First, I need to get... Okay. Can you say that again?
Yes. So at what point did you decide that it was time for a sale, that it was appropriate for you to consider selling the system?
So we had kind of trudged along, and for some of the newer franchisors here, the first 6 or 7 years of franchising was super difficult, so many learning lessons, so many mistakes made, and in 7 years, we had sold or awarded 20 or 60 units within 20 franchisees. And then when COVID hit, we had really gotten our act together, and we had really improved the support, the team, our franchise development, our marketing, and we grew by 400%. So we awarded 240 territories during that time, and it was bonkers. And I felt like at that point I was ready to get some more help, and it was a great time to diversify, and had the pleasure of meeting Boxwood and Authority Brands and Apax, and there was a really big opportunity there.
So you got to the point where you felt like you needed the help and you needed to bring on maybe more financing. How is it that you go about navigating those next steps? So everybody gets to that point where you reach that level of, well, not everybody, hopefully everybody gets to the point where you reach that level of growth, and now you've got a desire to take that next step. How do you find the right people? How did you meet Brian? Tell us about how you get engaged with an M&A advisory firm.
Well, I would say the hardest part about getting to the point where you can sell a franchise brand is getting to that point. And so I would encourage anybody who's building a brand, keep your head down, build a really strong system, and then you'll get a great valuation. And we had gotten to that point, and so I went to Springboard, actually, similar to this, same people, right? And I was on the hunt for the best investment banker that we could find because I knew I would not do the best job representing us in a sale. And so I met with each of the top investment bankers that was in franchising. Were all at that convention. I had a really hard time deciding because there's just a lot of really incredible talent, but that's how I got connected with Brian and the team.
And Brian, what is it about a client, a franchise system that makes them an attractive client for you? Someone that you know that you can work with. What was it about Junkluggers that made them?
My hair.
Not where I was going to take that question. No, I think I think from a macro perspective, right? We've done close to 35 transactions in franchising, 22 of them in home and residential services, right? So we've had experience seeing so many different franchise brands within that space, and there really is not too many competition. There's not a lot of competition in the junk space, right? You had Junk King, you had Junkluggers. There's a couple of smaller brands. Josh was on a great trajectory. I think Heather will probably talk about this too, but some of the trends that Josh was benefiting from are sustainable coming out of COVID. So we were pretty intrigued by the category overall, and then got a chance to meet Josh and his team and go through the process. And we're like, hey, there's something here, and we're really intrigued by what we're seeing from AUV growth. But the most important thing that we look at is unit level economics for the franchisee. So if your franchisees are not making money, then it's not as successful as a brand as maybe you think it is. And if you go up and down Josh's first quartile or the bottom quartile, the worst performing locations were still making really good money comparative to other franchise brands in the sector. So I really think it comes back to that profitability at the franchisee level, AUV growth, and what that cost benefit is for the franchisee. So you guys, I'm sure every franchisor in here says this, and a lot of you mean it, but it really is about promoting your franchisees, making them successful. And I think, that is what is attractive to the underlying, the private equity investment community, is that everyone in the system is making money, and that's always the key to success.
And Josh was able to demonstrate that. So I know that a pain point out there for many franchise systems is collecting that data on franchisee performance. It's the franchisee performance that demonstrates the quality of the royalty stream, and the royalty stream and the quality of that stream and the quality of the underlying franchise business is what drives that valuation. So Josh, what are the things that you did within your system to gather that data, compile that data, get it ready so that you can present it to Brian and to the other players here so that you could maximize valuation and successfully sell the company?
A bunch of things. I think, for one, making sure we had financials from each franchisee, which for many years was pretty hard to get. We utilized QVinci. I know there are other systems out there, but that aggregated the data and the financials for each of our franchisees. And we said to them, the benefit is that if you get on QVinci, you can benchmark yourself against other franchisees and help to see where you're winning or losing. So we had access to franchisee financials. Other than that, I would say being prepared was we had put a lot of good things in place. So we really worked hard to differentiate our brand. We added a secondary business model called Remix Market, which helps to keep items out of landfills by creating our own reuse centers, which I think was attractive and unique. We had been building a national accounts program which supported our franchisees and I think made the brand look more attractive. We have a national call center which answers all the calls for our franchisees with really strong conversion rates, because I think before we had that, you would hear franchisees saying, I could do this better than you, and now we don't hear those arguments. So those are just some examples of tightening up our systems, in addition to having people who are more organized than me on the team who could make sure all the documents were together as much as possible, right? He's shaking his head, to make it less painful.
The documents, we'll get to that. So talk to us about the process. So you're properly positioned for a sale transaction, and now you're engaging with Brian and with Boxwood Partners. What comes next? What does the process look like from there?
So here's what we say, the sale transaction process for us is a really cool experience. Josh has never been through a deal before.
Cool.
Right?
Intense.
It's very intense, but it's a cool part of the process. So a lot of hand-holding, a lot of education, a lot of why are we doing this, right? And I think that is one thing that I've said to Josh 100 times, is kind of trust the process, because there is a method to the madness. Gathering the data, collecting the data, looking at franchisee P&L, same-store sales, understanding your trends. I think a lot of times founders never kind of take their head out of the business to realize what they've built, and they've never looked at it from the perspective of an exit or how private equity may see it. So the little things that Josh was doing at Remix, he's like, oh, Remix Markets increased our AUVs by 20%. That's not something to flip in, and it's just a stat that says in a conversation. That is real value, right? And the thing that he did the best was stay really focused. He went an inch wide and a mile deep. And that, I would say, was a huge part of the value prop in the process, is that Josh was really good at hauling junk, running Remix Market, and making his franchisee successful. And staying in your lane, so to speak, within franchising is really hard to do, because there's a lot of creative people, a lot of creative ideas out there. But staying in that lane is the number one thing you can do as a franchisor. So from there, we'll put together marketing materials. We call it playing defense to play offense. So we're getting prepared for every question that Heather and Irene could possibly ask us, with data, support, documentation, working on the legal docs, whatever it may be, and we'll take that business to market. And typically what we do is run a two-step process where we'll get initial indications of interest, where people throw out a value and say, hey, here's where we think the value is. And then we try to down select to a certain number of groups to come and meet Josh, his team, learn more about the business before submitting a formal offer. So there's a lot of different ways to run a process. There's a lot of different types. There's a lot of different strategies that we can employ. But at its core, it's that two-bid process where you get a certain amount of information, you make a bid. If you're moving on to the next round, you get more information, get access to the team, meet Josh and the like, spend 5, 6, 7 hours, go to a dinner together, get access to more information, meet members of his team before kind of submitting that final offer. So, beginning to end, that process can take anywhere from as little as 4 months to as many as 8. So it's a lot of work, a lot of preparation. But I think yields the best results for the entrepreneurs. And at the end of the day, as we told you, you only get a chance to do this once, right? You only get a chance to bring on money for the first time, or an investor for the first time, one time. And we take a lot of pride and responsibility that we feel in that process. So we try to be as diligent as we can be.
Heather, what was it about Junkluggers that attracted Authority Brands? What does Authority Brands look for in a target?
Yeah, so there's a certain amount of attractiveness of certain verticals for us being in home service. So we had already identified that junk for us was a space we wanted to get in. There were a couple players in the space that were on the market at the same time. We're a little different than some other platforms in that we love to bring a founder along with us, because they have this operational knowledge and really this strength and background. And so for us, a lot of it is, it's a little bit like dating. Like, do we think that we have the right culture on our side to match the culture he built? Because the worst thing you can do to a franchise system where, Josh and team have sold location after location on the culture and values that they have, is to put them in with us and say all of a sudden overnight, that's all different. Your culture is different. Our values are different than yours are. So a lot of it is about how well do we think we'll work together. There's also a certain amount that's kind of to Brian's point, identifying areas where we think we can add value to take the business to the next level. So if a business has fully pulled every lever of maximizing profit across everything they have available, well, we probably can't grow it exponentially. It's probably on the trajectory already. For us, it's a little bit of a look in to say like, wow, there's a lot that's happening here, but we could really accelerate some of this if we put a little more resources behind it. Not to say we're trying to change the path that anybody's on, but really just to increase the angle of the growth curve. So it's a little bit of all of that. Part of the process that Brian pointed out of like getting access to the team and getting to spend time together, that's a really big part of it, because I think for a lot of us, we spend a lot of time in rooms like this with each other. We spend a lot of time working with each other. And so being able to feel like we can successfully work together, that we like each other. It sounds silly, but it's like a pretty basic thing. So it's a little bit of all of the above.
And what about the due diligence process? So What are you looking at in the due diligence process? It's an extensive process, and there's a lot of information that's populated, reviewed, considered. What are you looking for? What are red flags or issues? Not obviously with this brand, but maybe with some others that didn't go through to close.
Yeah, I think when we're going through diligence, part of it is, do we see an area for potential improvement, right? Because if we assume that we're only going to buy brands that are strong, established, solid brands, we're not really in the business of turnaround brands. That's not really what we do. So for us, seeing things and patterns in the data that say, hey, there might be a trend here that we could more fully exploit if we put more resources behind it. Or there might be something here that the team just hasn't had the bandwidth to focus on, or maybe they haven't noticed yet in the data. So a little bit of the diligence is identifying areas where we can create value moving forward. And then some of it is also just identifying what their processes are, right? So if you say like, hey, I want to, what's your marketing strategy? Let's see what's happened with your national advertising fund, and they can't produce any documents. Well, that's a scary thought, right? Because a lot of us know that ad funds are one of the most legally risky things that a franchise brand has. So, so there's always things that you're looking for. It's always a little bit like the difference between dating and diligence and then being married. Once you acquire someone, like you kind of figure some things out on the other side. But really diligence for us is just trying to validate what we're hearing in conversation and what we're learning through meetings, and making sure that just like that, the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, right? Can you produce all your agreements? Mm-hmm. I mean, that sounds basic, but it's pretty straightforward.
It sounds basic, but it's pretty complex. And I think hindsight is 20/20. And in working through a number of these transactions, if you're an emerging brand or an early growth brand, one of the smartest things you can do at this stage is to organize your documents, to organize your data in a way that's essentially the virtual data room that you're going to populate in a sale transaction. So you've got all of your corporate organization documents saved and housed in one organized spot, your franchise disclosure documents, franchise agreements, all of the information that you're going to need to load in to the data room for the buyer to review is something that you should be organized with from the beginning forward. And that's something that'll save time and money and aggravation, and chasing things down and plugging up holes will be easier.
And do it electronically. We've done a deal or two where we've scanned a lot of files.
Oh, wow.
So
with some of the older systems that with written agreements, that's unavoidable. But nowadays, with all of you, it should be easy enough to do it. And don't keep it with the third-party service providers. It's important to make sure that you're housing that data internally too. It's difficult, even with the third-party service providers, to pull the information and the documents that you're going to need to produce in the sale transaction to get through due diligence, to get through that review process. Where does the money come from?
Irene.
So for us, we're a private equity fund. We obviously like to partner with companies such as Authority Brands. So we actually purchased Authority Brands back in 2018 when it was 2 brands, and we grew it to 15 brands today. And part of the thesis and thought process behind it is we started from the macro. We thought about, why home services? Well, it's a large and growing industry that's highly fragmented. There's an opportunity to take share from local mom and pops, given there's greater sophistication towards digital marketing. There are tailwinds around things like aging homes in the US, dual income households, so less time to do housework. And so that's how we like to approach investments on the whole, thinking about the macro and thinking about the industry and attractiveness. And then we looked across scaled franchise players, and there weren't many at the time, back in 2018. I think there are more and more now. And we saw an opportunity with what happened with Dwyer, and Authority Brands was on the market. And so we saw an opportunity to really build out scale and become the next leading platform and player of choice. And when it comes to investing, we'll often invest with the thesis that M&A will require further equity. We also do expect rollover from our founders, and especially if they're continuing on. And even if they're not continuing on, we want to make sure they're aligned. And so we'll often give a chance to co-invest as well. And then we'll also do a mix of debt financing. And we help run that entire process because we have good relationships with lenders. We obviously have expertise doing that across our portfolio as well.
And can you talk a little bit more about the rollover process and how that's negotiated with the founders, and is how you select which executives you're going to offer positions to post-closing and post-closing employment and consulting arrangements, who you keep on, why, and how all of that is negotiated.
Yeah, I'm sure Josh will also provide his perspective. But from our point of view, what we really want to make sure is that incentives are aligned, because we want the founder to still have skin in the game. We want them to believe in the system. And it's beyond the founder, often the top folks in the cap table, because they will still believe in the story. And this is a chance to take some chips off the table, partner with a larger company that has had expertise, is willing to invest in your company and provide resources, but ultimately not a full exit in terms of how we like to look at strategies. And so we'll often have any folks that are continuing on that are in executive positions, especially if they are already in the cap table, roll over a pretty significant portion. And that piece is obviously up to negotiation and discussion, and is subject to that individual's personal life and considerations at that point and what they're looking to do. But we do think it's a good opportunity for you to get in at a relatively attractive time and help be part of the next level of growth. And so, we go into it with the idea that you'll make 2, 3x, 4x your money, ideally, in a few years, and it'll give you the opportunity to be part of a broader platform as well.
And Josh, running the company as founder is a different picture as staying on post-close and in the executive position. You want to talk a little bit about how that feels and what issues you've encountered post-closing, how it's different, maybe easier in some ways, maybe.
Well, Heather's here. I can't do that. I'm just kidding. I'll just say, just to close out that piece from my perspective, part of when I was looking for a deal was the opportunity to roll over some of it into what I felt was the best investment. It was like a super successful deal and totally life-changing, but I'm still relatively young, I think, and I wanted the opportunity to keep growing and have an opportunity to grow within an organization that I was a part of. So that was a big deal to me. And then how does it feel? It feels a little different. I think to the point around trying to find a company that has a culture that resonates with you, it's so important. This has been my baby. I started Junkluggers 20 years ago at 21 years old. It's like my firstborn. And so it's super emotional, and I'm sure there's some people here who can relate to that. So you want to know that, A, I'll be working with people that I like, respect, and take the brand to the next level, and B, that the brand's going to be in good hands. And so those were really important parts of my decision.
So one thing I would add, and this was, I can't remember exactly, I think it was the case for Josh. This is going to sound counterintuitive, but I would say 60% of the time, founders and entrepreneurs take the second highest price. Everyone's kind of looking at each other like, what? But at some point in time, the money becomes irrelevant, right? And a $5 million difference or a $10 million difference or a $15 million difference may make the difference between how he feels about working with Heather and the Authority Brands team versus another buyer versus this and that. And I know there's a bunch of folks in this here that have sold businesses recently, and I think can attest to it. But it really matters that you be able to have chemistry and you click with the other side. And at the end of the day, I've said this to you when we pitched, the best situation that we can have is have multiple offers within $5 million of each other and let Josh make a decision. I want to make it a really hard decision on Josh. We call it champagne problems, but have a champagne problem where you have the ability to choose your destiny and partner with who you want to partner with. And I think a lot of times the misconception is, oh, this person paid the most. And sometimes that is the case. But more often than not, especially for founder and entrepreneur-owned businesses or family-owned businesses, what we see is that it's the second highest price because, and Josh York is probably here somewhere, no asshole policy really matters in business. And if you're selling your baby and the thing that you've built, at some point you want to feel really good putting your head in the pillow knowing that you're partnering with someone who you believe in.
So one of the things, when we were all, well, maybe not all, but when a lot of us were at IFA back in February, it was pretty recent after Josh's deal went through. And there are definitely pain points that come when you sell your business. And he can speak to those way better than I can, but I feel them on my side too, being part of the bigger company that's absorbing in, all these other brands. And one of the things that I tried really hard to reiterate to him off the bat is like, man, we're not going to get it right all the time. we're going to screw up. We're going to do things and you're going to be like, oh my God, like this is my baby. And like, this is not exactly what I would have done if I was making every decision 100% by myself. But oh my God, will I do my best to be someone who you can trust and call. If you have a problem, you pick up the phone and call me and we're going to figure it out and we're going to work through it together and we're going to grow as an organization. I mean, Authority Brands as a company in 5 years went from 2 brands to 16 operating in 15 verticals. Like we're basically like the oldest startup in franchising. Like our brands are old, but we are young as a company. And so we've got a lot of things to figure out and we have a lot of ways we can improve. But if at the end of the day, we just like each other and we trust each other, that's something you can't really replicate in another environment. So it's not going to always be easy, but we're going to do our best to always be good to each other as part of the process. And there's a certain value you can't necessarily put on that.
How do you plan for the transition and the communication with the franchisees? So at some point you announce the transaction and that creates emotions on the franchisees' end. How do you go about tackling announcing to the system that a transaction's taking place, about to take place, or just took place? And how do you manage the relationship from a post-close perspective?
It's very detailed.
It's very sensitive. And I think regardless of how nice your email is, or your announcement is, when it first comes, it's going to become a shock. You can't let people know in advance. And for me, and I'm sure for a lot of other brands, part of why a franchisee invests is they believe in the founder, right? And they believe in the team, and they're really afraid of what's going to happen next. And things like private equity and acquisitions are really scary. So I would say the announcement is like 2%, 1%, it's all about what happens after that. Allowing franchisees to know that we're here, talking a lot, communicating, and then eventually going back to business as usual, which is where we're starting to get to now, I think helps people to feel more comfortable that this is the same company that I chose and I invested in, but now there's a lot more horsepower behind it. And so if you can get them to see that light, that's huge. It's really, really hard, and it just takes some time and dedication. Like if I were looking back and doing things over, I would have said, that's 50% of my job after this transaction is to make sure that the people who believed in me know that I believe in them and that we're still there for them. And the same thing goes for employees, man. I'll tell you, a lot of nervous employees, no matter how nice I tried to paint a rosy picture about how I felt about the transaction, they need to see it for themselves and you need to really be there for them.
Sure, I'm sure it triggers a lot of nervous energy.
So you had an event in February, early February? So one of the things too for us is like, if it's possible, as soon as we buy a brand, we want to meet the franchisees. So a handful of us went out to an event that Josh had already had planned just to be there, like just to be in the room, to talk to the franchisees, to not be this like big, scary, like we're this new company that is like, we're real people. We bought this brand for a reason because we believe in it. And it's also a big reason why we like to buy businesses where we can bring the founder along with us, because that operational consistency is really important to be able to say like, Josh is still your guy. Like we're just here to help in other ways and to bring more resources to the table. And we just want to get to know you guys for a while. So I think for us too, we've gotten better and better at how we integrate brands over time. Apologies to some of our early brands where we maybe didn't do it quite as well. But we're getting better, a little bit better every time. But that's a big part of it is because, I think we all experienced it during COVID when we had all this time away from our franchisees. You can say things and you can put things in email, but there's something about a personal connection and being face to face. And so when I can show up and they see like all of us interact with each other, they see the leadership team from Authority Brands with Josh's team at Junkluggers, like, and that we actually like each other and we're getting along and we're excited to meet the franchisees and we're ready to like just learn more about their businesses. It's a different type of conversation than when you're getting an email that says like, we've been acquired and nothing's going to change and call me if you have questions, right? Like being able to get some FaceTime right off the bat is really important. So I know it's not always possible, but anybody that's thinking about doing a deal or a transaction, it is incredibly valuable to be able to try and time it with some face time with your franchisees. If not everybody, then just the ones on your leadership team, the ones on your advisory council, so that they see the interaction and what it's like, so that it brings them comfort. And we all know that franchisees listen to other franchisees more than they ever listen to any of us. So the more that you can start to build that, that relationship and have them understand kind of what it's really like, the better off you are.
Let me add one thing to that along the same line. So how many franchisors are out there again? There's a lot of people are franchisors. Everyone wants to sell their business like Josh did. Am I right? That is the goal. The goal is to grow. The goal is to get bigger, provide benefits to your franchisees. And most likely at some point, everyone wants to sell to private equity. We've seen it done so many different ways. Josh had a very small group under the tent from the get-go. On his transaction, we've seen deals where we did a label business, older gentleman. He walked into his business, 150 employees, and he goes, "Hi, everyone. We're selling. I've been in this for 35 years. I want liquidity. I thank you for your help. Please don't be an asshole to Brian." So I've seen it on like the one spectrum and the other. Bringing people under the tent is really sensitive, and it's a hard thing to do, and it's a hard decision to make. I would tell you both ways can be successful, but don't be scared to kind of bring people under the tent and say, "Hey, here's the goal," right? I started this business when I was 21. The goal is to sell it. I have an opportunity to do so. I appreciate everything, but the transparency there sometimes also builds trust. So I think we've seen a lot more of the, "Hey, I'm not going to tell anyone, and I'm only going to tell 2 or 3 people," than we have seen, "I'm going to tell everyone." But I think at some point, and you've said this too, the piggy bank of Josh was only so big. There's only so many ways that he could invest in the business for what the earnings were at that point in time. Bringing on someone like Apax or Authority Brands to allow you to go take risks that you normally wouldn't take, right? Because it's your butt on the line when you're making those decisions. That freedom is something that you get. And I think a lot of your franchisees or employees will probably respect you for that and understand if you're transparent about it.
Something also important to think about, especially if you're planning on selling to a private equity fund, is the different cultures of the private equity fund. Because people do have very different types of investing styles, and it's a different level of reporting, probably, that you'll have to do than your typical day-to-day now. And they'll also probably bring on board members who have different types of expertise. So really trying to go into a private equity fund that has domain expertise, has done it before, you think will actually add value on your board, and not spend your time chasing things that don't necessarily matter or doing double clicks that don't really matter, but working with a team that you feel like actually has faith in you and wants to back you and will trust you to do the operational day-to-day. I think you'll be able to sense that during diligence. And I also think, secondly, thinking about the private equity fund's investment style. So we're similar to AB, where we like to invest in growth-oriented companies. That's part of why I invested in AB. But for example, what that means is the initial years we're willing to make the investment of the extra fan dev resources you'll need to grow your brand faster, to invest in digital marketing, data and analytics and platforms so you can see a top line growth and can see that ROI. But not all private equity firms are necessarily as growth focused, where, for example, we invested in a mobile app for TCA that takes a while to actually build out and so on. So it's helpful to actually ask your partner, or your private equity potential partner, what value add you think they can bring to you, really, doing the double click on culture and trying to get these soft aspects, which you can do throughout the diligence process as well. Because it is like a dating process with your eventual investor as well.
I will just add that I agree completely, and you need to hear what the private equity firm says and also do your homework. It was really important to me that we didn't sell to private equity and they just stripped down the company. That would hurt a lot, and they had a track record of not doing that, of investing in growth rather than cutting back. So I can attest to that 100%.
Josh, if you could go back to 2012, what would you do differently?
I think that we spent like a bunch of years just like stepping on our own toes, and a lot of it was because I started by trying to build a franchise organization with the people who are running the company-owned operations. And I had heard again and again and again that doesn't work, but I guess I had to find it out for myself because I felt a lot of loyalty to those people versus just having them grow within the space that they already know and are comfortable with. So I feel like as soon as I started to surround myself with the right franchise people and the right franchise partners and vendors, it made such a difference, especially because I didn't have franchise experience myself.
So just to add a little bit of that same perspective, but from maybe the brand side. So we own 35, we'll call it, company-owned stores across the 15 verticals in which we operate. As we start to diversify the brands that we're investing in and focusing in a certain sector of our business on emerging brands, so brands that are significantly smaller than what Josh built, but brands that maybe have 3, 5, 20 franchisees. One of the things that is incredibly challenging in those businesses is exactly what Josh just called out. So for anybody who's in a brand that's about that size and you have a company-owned operation, we operate with completely split teams. The corporate stores are run by a team that reports into an infrastructure of people who only handle the corporate stores, including the marketing team, the operations team. Everybody is dedicated because their management of KPIs is so much different and so day-to-day versus what you need on the franchise side. And a lot of times what we see is it's really hard for people to flip the hat back and forth. So it's a good thing to call out from Josh's perspective. If you're planning to exit and you're thinking that that's something that's in kind of your immediate future, it's valuable to have kind of a delineation of who's part of the brand and who's part of the store operations, because that's a huge thing when we look at a business to say, like, well, you've grown a great business. Maybe there's 2 locations, maybe there's 3. You really have the team that can support 5, 10, 15, 100, right? Like, do you have the expertise, the subject matter expertise to do it? Or are people too divided, and are they focusing in too many areas?
Yeah, so I'll bring in kind of the first conversation from today. So I want to say something. Irene, I would love for you to comment on this too, but having corporate locations is not a negative thing in a franchise system at all. You know, and I would argue that franchise systems that have corporate locations are better franchisors because of it, because of some of the things that Neil talked about earlier. Now, you don't need a corporate location. Josh had a corporate location. He was probably, 50-50 when you went to market, right? It was about 50% corporate location, 50% of the franchisor. Having that test area, understanding the business gives you credibility to your franchisees, and it's super important, right? And I think that's something that got lost. I mean, Authority Brands has way more corporate locations than Neighborly does. But from a valuation standpoint, I know it's what everyone asks me about all the time, not that different when it's all said and done. That's high value, recurring cash flow when you do it right. So I would encourage everyone not to think about corporate stores as a negative, and more often than not does fund the growth of the franchisor.
Yeah, so I would definitely agree with that. I'd say that it does become a question of priorities, where because your retail stores are taking too much time away from your ability to invest in growing the franchise system, I think that's when for us in diligence it becomes a question of, are you allocating time effectively? And I do think that, to Brian's point, we've seen it add credibility with franchisees, whether it's a testing ground or training ground, et cetera. So, from our perspective, makes sense, and we ultimately trust the founder or management team to have a point of view on where the right line is. But I will say for us too, part of the attractiveness of the franchise system is the fact that you're able to scale so quickly across very motivated individuals. You're able to be a business in a box and grow quickly. So I would say that we still like that piece conceptually a little bit more, but we definitely understand why folks have a retail store.
One more thing I would say, and this may resonate with some of you guys, is you asked about what were some of the impetuses for getting to that next level, and those first few years that were really difficult. I physically had to remove myself from the company operations. We made a whole new office 30 minutes away just for the franchise operations because I couldn't stay out of it, right? And then, surprisingly, the next year, things took off. So I just want to encourage you guys to think about that a little bit.
What about from a valuation perspective when franchise systems are structuring their royalty streams? What is the preferred structure? A percentage revenue, percentage of gross revenue, a mixture of a minimum flat or percentage? When you're valuing that royalty stream, yeah, I think Heather. Yeah.
It's a very loaded question. No, so when we think about the value of a system, and I think we probably all would have a slightly different take on this exact question based on the seat we sit in. But one of the lenses we try to put on at Authority Brands, right, is thinking about what we call royalty plus. So it's the combination of every fee structure that you've created attached to your agreements. So it's not just your royalties, it's any other fee you charge. It's your technology fee. It's any fees you have from call center, from marketing, from anything else. And we look at it as a percentage all rolled up together. So to a certain extent, it doesn't really matter if your royalty fee is capped, if it's a sliding scale. Our bigger concern is what's your royalty plus? Like what's the all-in percentage that we're looking at as it relates to revenue? And certain brands do that in a different way. We have certain brands in our own system that do that in a very different way. We have some that operate call centers that are for profit, that add a significant amount of revenue to our bottom line. We have some that operate call centers as at a loss because they have fee structures that make up for it in other places. So there is no, in my mind, real right answer to how your royalties should be structured, except don't give concessions on royalties. I guess I'll say that. But maybe think about it at a slightly higher level to say, okay, royalties are a part of a bigger stream of potential revenue. What is your royalty plus? And what does it look like for your competitors? Get their FDDs, go through all of it, and figure that out, because that's really what differentiates brand to brand more than just royalties on their own.
What about territory structuring and how that's...
Yeah. So everybody structures their territories differently. Everyone in here that's touched Fran Dev at all knows that. So there's a certain, when we acquire a brand, one of the things we look at right away is basically the saturation of how much revenue they're doing based on the area they have. Are they maximizing the territories that their franchisees own, or do we need to work through with the brand operations team pulling back or clawing back some territory? And it's a very delicate balance, as I'm sure a lot of you guys have experienced, because a lot of franchisees like to land grab. And a lot of franchisors sometimes struggle with the enforcement of minimums because it's a little bit of a challenging conversation. So it's one of the conversations we have pretty early in the process, because we refile our FDD right when we acquire a brand. So that's one of the early conversation points to say, hey, your competitors are doing it like this. You're doing it like this. We're learning the vertical, so we don't know your space as well. Help us understand why it's structured the way it is, and then trying to get to a spot where in our platform, the desire is to have, territories that are doing upwards of $1 million in revenue. So are we structured in a way that makes that possible? Or do we need 2 territories to make that happen, or 3 territories to make that happen? And let's make sure we're doing transactions that support the size of business that we want from an AUV perspective. So there's no right answer to how big a territory should be, but it does have a lot to do with understanding your competitors and their fee structure, and understanding how your franchisees are operating and what your current existing franchisees are able to do within the territories they have.
Yeah, I'll kind of bring that back to something I said earlier, but it all comes back to how much money and how well your franchisees are doing, right? If I think about Josh's business versus Mosquito Hunters, right, or versus Stretch Zone or Massage Heights, they're all very different, right? So it's the customer lifetime value in that 4-wall EBITDA type of business. It's the revenue per population or per household for Josh, right? And the mosquito businesses or the route-based businesses like Duty Calls that are out there are all about, hey, how much money can you make in a certain population, a certain zip code to be profitable? And I would say that's kind of goes back to, so if you're a newer brand, as you're thinking about your territory or your population size, think about how do you get to a franchisee making somewhere between, at a minimum, $50,000 a year, because they're leaving a corporate location to start a new job, upwards from there, right? And Josh needs to cover a different territory in New York to get to $1 million of revenue versus Richmond, Virginia versus Baltimore, Maryland, right? So I think you have to think about that as your service model on a revenue per population, per household, customer lifetime value. What can you get to that makes sense for your franchisees, and kind of work backwards from there?
Heather, what other types of cleanup would you expect a franchise system that's positioning for an acquisition to do before closing? Are there areas that often require cleanup?
Should I say hire Brian? I'm kidding. No. So I think when you think about it, like the comment that was made earlier about like get your files in order, that sounds really silly, but the amount of asks you're going to get from people like me on the other side that are saying like, oh, I want to see your ad funds for the last 5 years. Do you have audited financials on XYZ, right? So it sounds silly to say like just get organized, but just make a habit of being organized as part of just kind of the day-to-day. So that's a thing. I think one of the things that we also spend a lot of time doing is just trying to understand the team. What's the team? What's their role? Kind of putting on a marketing hat for a second, right? Like if you have staff that's built into the ad fund, what are they doing? Are they really doing the right things? Like is everybody falling in the right seat? So there's a lot of things that we kind of do and look at, but from like a cleanup to prep perspective, the best thing you can do is get organized before you start the process. And then it makes it easier for us on the flip side, right? Because we're going to want access to everything right away. We need logins to this. We need access to this. We need to be able to touch this vendor just to understand kind of what's happening and what's going on. So the more that you just kind of have organization and documentation around your systems, your processes, the easier it'll be, the least painful diligence will be.
Diligence is definitely a process. I would say that for us too, I think the way that we think about approaching diligence and data is different than I think how a lot of founders run their day-to-day. So to the extent that you can set up your reporting such that you're collecting the next order KPIs, or for example, on system-wide sales, if you can do a double click on number of customers, average price per service, number of services you're doing, that gives us comfort in the franchisee health and systems as well. Of course, not every franchisor is able to do this. But if you think about fundamentally what we're trying to diligence, it's the franchise health and systems, to the points made prior. And one of these proxies is actually looking at, franchisee closures. And so we like to spend a lot of time talking about, why did XYZ franchise close? And why did you not resell? What's your process for maintaining contingency plans? And within the top line growth, is this driven by just a few franchisees? Is it driven across the system? And what is driving this growth? Is it purely price? Is it customers as well? So we like to do next order double clicks. And for example, within your more mature brands, or mature franchisees, I should say, are they still growing as well, or have they stagnated? And what processes do you have in place to help them keep growing as well? Or have you pulled the pricing lever enough? So we really do like to get down in the weeds on data, and I think about things and cut things in ways that can be unexpected, but we'll spend a lot of time even going on the individual owner level to really understand what's going on in the system.
And Irene, you're working with Authority Brands on the due diligence process? Do you run your own due diligence, or do you rely on the due diligence report that Authority Brands provides? How do you, from the funding perspective, handle the diligence?
Yeah, so I'll say that that's evolved as Authority Brands has gone more mature in their M&A process. The first few deals we basically helped run on our end, similar to how we'd run a new process entirely, and obviously incorporated Heather and team for their perspective throughout. But as Authority Brands has gone more mature, now we have an actual M&A team that does a lot of this heavy lifting, on the franchise perspective, and they'll send all the reports to us. The person on the M&A team is actually an ex-Apax employee who has now left to go run corp dev, so he knows our systems and processes very well at this point, and it'll be a board-level discussion of some of the key outputs of deciding what's the right valuation, is this attractive, should we go for it or not, at any of the key touch points, but they're very independent now.
Can I add something on the question before? So one of the things that's been a very common call out over the last few deals that I think is interesting just for the group with everybody who's a franchisor in here, one of the most common pushback questions that we get is on territories sold but not open. So that's a super common, why haven't they opened? Why aren't they opening in the schedule that was promised or whatever? So just keep that in mind as you're thinking about development, that it's great to sell and you want to sell people the right amount, but if you oversell at a certain point and you go to exit, it will become a thing that you have to explain in great detail. And then based on what that looks like, it might just be that the timeline in which your commitment was given should have been stretched a little bit. Maybe people didn't need 3 years, maybe they needed 5. great. Make sure you're adjusting your contracts to reflect whatever that is so that your agreements aren't just outdated and, oh, this agreement didn't execute fully, that you have an amendment to say, okay, this is what the plan is. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking about how you're selling territories, is that that'll be something that is a big question is, hey, you sold 400, but there's 100 open. What's with those other 3?
And set the precedent early of taking them back. Okay, so I think that's the consistency. Like if I showed up in a deal with Josh or Heather and there's 100 signed but not open locations, do you have precedent or a track record of taking back locations that were not opened on time and where they defaulted on development schedule? That is a massive piece of credibility you can have in a process when you're going to sell, to say, hey, we have a track record of taking back locations because so-and-so didn't open what they were supposed to open the first couple of years. And I would say the earlier you set that precedent within your system, the better off, because it sends a message to the rest of the franchisees.
How critical are franchise sales compliance practices in dealing with liability exposure, maybe adjustments to purchase price? Talk to me about the importance of franchise sales compliance and the growth of the system.
Compliance is incredibly important. If legal was here, they would say that it's incredibly important. I think that's one of the biggest things, right? I kind of just referenced, like, if you're going to change something that you have an agreement on, right? If you're going to change a development schedule to say, hey, it was 3 and now it's 5, you need to have your documents reflect that. So everything needs to be papered, because what ends up happening when you start going through a process is the more that you're saying, like, oh, well, I told this guy this and that's okay, and I told this guy this and that's okay, and it all just lives in someone's brain, that's really scary. Right? When we're thinking about that, it's like, oh my gosh, there is one mission critical human that knows everything about every deal that was ever given to every franchisee, but none of it's papered, none of it's executed. That's incredibly, incredibly scary. So I think just across the board, anything that's contractual, if something changes, right? If a start date and open date that you have calendared for April turns into October, great, paper it. Like, put everything on paper, because what ends up happening is when we start to validate contracts and things are all over the place. Like, well, this guy says he opened in April, but he didn't have any revenue until a year and a half later. So did he really open? No, he didn't. It starts to make it hard for us to look at the data on revenue and system-wide sales to try and forecast how long it takes an operation to ramp, because that's one of the things we're looking to validate, right? Is if we put a lot of resources behind Fran Dev and we accelerate sales, what's the ramp cycle like? Like, how does that translate, right? So I would just say, just in general, for anything that's done in contract, if there's a change to a contract that you're agreeing to do, you need to have it papered and you need to have it documented. It can't just be like something that lives in your COO's brain or in your brain to say, like, oh yeah, that's right, I told that guy he could have an extra year to do this. Just put it on paper. It'll make your life easier.
And ideally with a release included in there.
See, you're the attorney, so you know all the...
There's legal.
I would just, to back all that up, you don't get away with anything when it comes to selling to a legitimate private equity company. And if you do, then I would reassess the deal in general. So I just want to make that clear. It is an all-consuming process, and they look at everything.
Every single detail.
I'm pretty sure there was like someone tailing me for a while, like legit.
Every single detail. So franchise sales compliance, what you're putting in your PowerPoints, often that's loaded in to the data room and reviewed through the investigatory process. And if you've got financial performance representations included in there and that information's not in your item 19, well, that's a red flag and that's a problem. And that's something that you're going to have to deal with either in the purchase agreement through increased holdbacks or maybe expansion of indemnification obligations. This panel, I had a similar session earlier in the week that was all legal, and the content was completely different because it was all focusing on the importance of having buttoned up franchise agreements, complying with the franchise regulations, registration process. You need to be able to demonstrate that you did what the law requires you to do, and all of that is going to be uncovered in this sales process. And if you can't back that up, well, then the deal probably isn't going to go through. So be very responsible with your growth and with your documentation. Anytime you can secure releases when you're giving extensions or you're giving concessions, you should have those. So that could help buffer against issues that may have occurred in the sales process so that you don't deal with those types of cleanup issues when you're going through the sale transaction. Be prepared.
Okay, folks, we're going to leave room for 5 minutes of questions, and then we're going to roll into Shark Tank in 10. JoyAnn, I'll let you take it back.
Questions?
Any questions?
Yeah.
Red, go for it. You can enunciate. You got it.
What's your biggest regret in regards to this process, going from the owner of it all to not?
I'm feeling pretty good right now. I don't know if I have a lot of regrets. But I would say preparing emotionally for giving up your baby, and the first 6 months has helped me because I was expecting that I was going to go through some ups and downs. So I don't know if that's a good answer.
Any other questions, folks? Good question.
No other questions? Yes.
I'm coming to you.
This one's for Brian. I think it's important for a lot of the group in here, because this is the first time for Young Conference and maybe like emerging brands. For us to stretch on, we just went through this process with Boxwood. They were great. And, Brian, I think, step one in the process, which, and Josh, you can allude to this, is a very convoluted process, something you maybe didn't know prior to going through it, is really vetting a trusted investment banking firm that you can really trust. And so for Brian, for us, we used to think that they were business brokers at the time, and then we learned a lot different. And Brian, what are some of the things that people should look out for and vet when looking to find a trusted investment banking firm?
Well, appreciate the question, bud. Someone who cares, truly. I think you both can probably attest to this. We talked every day for the better part of 6 months. Favorites. I was favorited. No, I think you got to know someone who knows what they're talking about, has done this in the space before. Franchising is very specialized. And I would tell you, when we started doing this, we'll bring it full circle this morning. We actually, we cut our teeth in franchising because we were owners, operators, and then eventually sold Sweet Frog frozen yogurt back in the day. My brothers and I are still franchisees. So understanding the pain points of franchising is really important. And you have to understand the nuances of it in order to position it, to answer some of the questions on the franchise sales front, to answer how to position the royalty revenue, the recurring piece of that, understanding, what's feasible and what's not. There's a lot of good questions. So ask for references, though. I think that's the biggest thing. Ask people for former clients, good, bad, or indifferent. Talk to them, understand what they went through. There's a lot of nuances to a process that you can't prepare for. We talked about documentation earlier. We had a deal held up recently over a copier lease. We couldn't find a copier lease. We couldn't get the consent from the landlord because they wanted to hold the deal hostage to increase rent at the franchisor entity. Little things like that you never kind of anticipate. You'll hear the horror stories or hear the stories about all the things you went through, and you want to be able to feel comfortable calling that person at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday and saying, hey, I'm really worried about X. What are your thoughts here? And I think those conversations happen all the time. So I appreciate the question, and I just ask for references and talk to past clients.
Awesome. Does anybody else have any other questions? Okay, well, I'd love to take a round of applause for everybody. Red again, okay.
What do y'all's cost? The Zor is interested. They're looking around at Boxwood and others. What does it cost the Zor to work with somebody like you?
I'd say it's priceless, not even joking aside, but.
So for the way that we would structure transactions, very standard across the industry, we would charge a monthly fee. For us, depending on the size of the Zor, it's somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 a month, which is we don't get paid, for the record, unless the transaction closes. So if we worked with you for 8 months and charged him $5,000 a month, we put a full team on the transaction, we would make $40,000. So we don't get paid unless the deal closes. We would structure a transaction to kind of align incentives. So for, to make the math easy, it'd be $10 up to a certain value and a certain percentage over that. And we work with you to kind of determine that. We know where market values are. we'll kind of show you what market value is and kind of what we think we can get you in the market. I think the biggest thing for founders and entrepreneurs is managing expectations. And what we try to do is be realistic about what we think we can get you in the market. So, if it's a $100 million transaction, we might take a base fee of $1.5 million up to 100. And then anything over 100, you would keep 94% of the benefit, and we would take 6%. So we try to align that incentive for us to get you the best possible deal, while also creating value for you. And that's a delicate balance. And the worst thing that can happen in a process for us in particular is telling Josh we can get him X, and then we turn around and get him not even close to that. And we love to surprise with the upside, but once you enter a transaction, we try to make sure that we're transparent about it, and appreciate Josh's comment. But I think there's a lot that goes into a transaction until you do it. You probably don't appreciate how much time, energy, and effort it takes. And we try to be upfront about what we think that's going to cost you and kind of what we think we can deliver on value. Appreciate it.
We'll say, though, don't feel like you need to hire an M&A banker. We love Brian. He's great. The Boxwood team is great. But we also do deals directly with folks as well. So that's also definitely an option and something that some of our past brands have done as well, although there are obviously benefits to working with banks.
And it moves fast. The deal moves fast from LOI to closing. What are you looking at? In 60 to 90 days? So I know you had mentioned like the romance part of it takes a few more months, but once you have that LOI signed, purchase agreement negotiations, due diligence, it's a fast-moving train.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a bunch of private equity firms in this room. I mean, kudos to Authority Brands, Princeton Equity, Riverside. From the time an LOI is signed, we've seen deals done in as little as 29 days. And that is a absolute whirlwind. I would say on average it's probably 45, but there's certain things you can't prepare for. Most recently was some tax structuring issues on a few deals that you just don't know until you get into the weeds that, hey, you never got your S Corp election signed off on by the IRS, and someone says you're a C Corp and you owe $10 million in additional taxes. Well, we're gonna take the time to figure it out. So it can move really fast, it moves slow, and it's really dependent more so on us and our client than it is on the buyers.
Any other questions?
I would also just say it's free to interview investment bankers. But when you make the decision, make sure you're ready, because the thing I heard again and again is don't jump into the pool and then pull back because you try to take another dip in the water and it's really going to affect that. And people are going to know that you may be more talk. So I made sure I was ready.
Okay, I think that's it. JoyAnn and Everett, the crew, thank you very much.